Good to see everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. For those of you who do not know me, and a refresher for those who do, my name is Nathan Hassall. I'm the current Poet Laureate of Malibu. And this is...
Woohoo!
Yeah! I love doing these events in America. There's just so much more like oomph. And in England it's like, yeah, keep going. So Caffeinated Verse is a monthly event where we have a featured reader. The way that it's structured today is that we'll have our feature come up and read his poems, and then we're going to sit down and have a Q&A. The Q&A starts with me asking 3 to 4 questions, and then we have a few from the audience before we have a break. Then we have one other special guest, followed by the open mic. In poetry, there are moments that I call conversion moments. Moments where a poet's turn of phrase or image converts the reader into the overall poetic vision. Similar to how a musician uses a hook or a riff or a chorus that transmutes the listener into an altered state. A conversion moment opens an inner gate for the rest of the expression to flood in. In Rilke's poem, The Panther, the dark-furred cat is pacing back and forth behind bars. In Stephen Mitchell's translation, the poem ends, an image enters in, rushes down through the tensed, arrested muscles, plunges into the heart, and is gone. The image and the poem itself plunges into the reader's heart. The moment may have gone, but the experience of it seeps into a mysterious somewhere. After rereading today's feature's work, while recently in the Californian desert city of Joshua Tree, I had another conversion moment while reading the poem, A Swarm of Dawns, a Flock of Restless Noons, where the following image converged from the peripheries of consciousness into my heart. Quote, the knife was very sharp. The scented rose-orange moons, quarter moons, of fruit fell to the cutting board so neatly. It was as if 2 people lived in separate cities and walked to their respective bakeries in the rain. This moment reminded me of the English poet Owen Barfield, who discussed utilizing strangeness in poetry, not merely as eccentric or an acrobatic quirk, but as a powerful force with an interior significance which gives a felt change in consciousness. Strangeness, according to Barfield, must be pleasurable. The strangeness inherent in our feature's poetry, alongside his pilled open, exacting images, is certainly pleasurable. Among many things, our feature today is a celebrated American poet, essayist, and translator. Born in 1941 in San Francisco, he explores themes of nature, family, desire, environment, love, language, and social justice in his poetry. His poetry collections include Field Guide, Praise, Time and Materials, and The Apple Trees at Olema. A Pulitzer Prize national book and Wallace Stevens Award winner, amongst others, today's feature served as the Poet Laureate of the United States from 1995 until 1997. Please welcome to the podium, Robert Hass.
Thank you, Nathan. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I was invited. I thought, how do you turn down a Poet Laureate? So, you've been writing poetry for 60 years, and you're going to read poetry for a few minutes. What do you read? Partly, the first thing I did, the real gift, was to invite my wife to read with me. She's going to read after. Brenda Hillman has published 11 books of poems, and I've been trying to get her to publish her writing about poetry because she has a very rich Some have said strange. Others have said very original mind. And she's just published a set of lectures for 3 talks about magic, mystery, and
Metaphor.
morality and metaphor.
Whoa.
So we're celebrating. So I'll read a few, just read recent poems. So this is called A Sunset. The sky tonight at the top of the ridge was bruise-colored, a yellow-brown that is one definition of the word sordid, and which I think, used to describe a color, carries neither a moral nor an aesthetic judgment. The sky at dusk was sordid, and then brightened and softened to a glowing peach of brief but astonishing beauty, if you happen to be paying attention. I could take a hard right here to the angry adolescent boy in Texas who shot and killed 19 children with a high-powered rifle my culture put into his hands. How to enter the hive of that mind and undo what the imagination had done there. He wore a flak jacket, bought 2 rifles at a local store, one of which fires 40 rounds a minute. He had it specifically in mind to kill children of that age, the lithe-bodied young in their end-of-term clothing. The connective tissue in this veering is the idea that the experience of beauty, not rules, not fear of consequences or reverence for authority, that informs our moral sense. This may be where John Ashbery would introduce a non sequitur, not from aversion to responsibility, but from a sense he no doubt had that there was a kind of self-importance in introducing morality to poetry, and that one might therefore be better off practicing one's art in more or less the spirit of the poor juggler in the story of Christmas, who, having no gift to bring to the infant God, crept into the church in the night and faced the creche and juggled. Play, beauty, the impulse to reproduce it, the impulse to evoke and bring to rage, and then to stillness the violence in our natures. One does not, the argument is, watch Lear and then go out and kill someone. The next veering, undertaken without cynicism but in a spirit of frankness, leaving aside Plato's originary arguments, would be to introduce the collection of records they found in Adolf Hitler's bunker. There were more than 100 of them. Wagner, of course, the operas especially, but also Mussorgsky, Rachmaninoff. He must have turned to rest his mind from reports on the success of Zyklon B to the concertos of Rachmaninoff. Monet might be the counterexample. I've read that in his distress at hearing descriptions of the violence of the earlier war, the mud and excrement and rotting bodies and barbed wire, poison gas, the rows on rows of young men hurled by their officers at one another's cannons and machine guns. He rose one morning, walked down to his studio by the Pont de Giverny, and began to paint the water lilies, and kept painting them as long as his hand could hold a brush. It's late. I need to return to the subject of that boy's mind, and the art we practice, and the sunset, peach to dull gold, which faded in what felt for just a second, for less than a second, a blessed and arriving silence, and then a pale green at the skyline, and then dark was a Monday night. Plato's idea was that beauty was an ordering of the elements the world offered, and that the harmonies in that order taught the soul the good. Later culture would say that boy was taken by a demon and study ways to exorcise it. The devil had a name. It was love of evil. And us? Is there a practice of the arts that would install, inform, would deeply root a culture, that would form a mind or heart in which those young bodies on the classroom floor had become unimaginable from a love of the good, as ordinary as children's tennis shoes? Probably not. Do we need to be able to touch that mind at that age? It could have been from being laughed at once. Or perhaps there was a sexual thrill in putting on the costume, carrying the rifle, saying, "I am doom," as he strode across the parking lot. Is there a way to undo the stew of computer games and horror films and superhero fantasies that gave language to the moral injury he wanted to inflict, or the culture of resentment and fear that put that weapon in his hands? These people run governments. Here's another hard right turn. Think of how Walt Whitman loved this country, loved the president who died, imagined himself as a hand brushing a fly from the brow of a sleeping child. In the dark, I thought of a radiant ordinariness that burned and burned.
Can we hear it up again for Robert Hass? So I'm gonna compose myself after that last poem and maybe take a veer somewhere that's perhaps slightly lighter before I'm sure we'll talk about that some more. My first question for you is, I know that you've translated many haiku poets like Basho, Buson and Issa. How did that change your relationship to image and conciseness in poetry?
Well, my relationship to haiku began when I told a friend, a poet, when I was in my early 20s, he said he was reading haiku, and I said, knowing nothing about them, though those are the stuffed animals of poetry. It was because in those days there would be bookshops with little thin books of haikus, and that inevitably translated them by overstating the emotion in them. The emotion would be implied in the poem. It would be something like, autumn evening, a crow just settling on a bare branch. That would be the whole poem. And the English translation in these Peter Piper books that I was reading would be, a crow settling on a bare branch, loneliness. So that was, I thought they were very corny, and my friend, when I said, he said, "You're really ignorant, you should read some." And I started reading there's a 4-volume set of translations of English haiku, of Japanese haiku that tell the story by an English scholar, writer who was retained during World War II in Japan, and he spent it translating these poems. And I was just starting to write poetry myself. Partly it involved with trying to write about California, the way I was saying, what the weather is, what the plants and things were to bring our California world into also in my generation, I should say, all the readers for kids were published in Boston or New York. So Dick and Jane were always going out where there were lots of red barns and jumping up and down in autumn leaves. So I was interested in the question of how to make this world of ours into place. So that was what got me going on the haiku. And then at a certain point, I realized if I was going to understand how they worked, I would need to understand the grammar. So I had the bad idea of taking a night school, high school class in beginning Japanese, conversational Japanese, which was mostly Japanese Americans who didn't speak the language and who were wanting to learn it so they could go to Japan and buy stuff. So everything I was learning was, like pretty much as that. And how about, but I did get just enough to be able to, and I just fell in love with the thing I was saying in my poem, the thingness of things in the haiku. It just seemed a spectacular way of thinking about the world, and the artists in that tradition, going back to the Heian court really, have been thinking about how to express the world through images of the world. What would be the absolute killer way to get a warm October day in Malibu? Pick out one thing and do it. So that was how I fell in love with it. And the first effect it had on my own poetry is I would write a poem and think, a haiku poet could do this in 3 words. I can't. So anyway, that's enough, I guess, on that subject.
Thank you. I guess moving on, you mentioned going to Japan to buy stuff. I know while you were Poet Laureate of the US, you would go into business places and take poetry where it either is and you don't know it's there, or it isn't traditionally. How did you find, being an ambassador for poetry in spaces that aren't typically associated with it?
What are you doing about being Poet Laureate?
I think there's many people who are poetry curious, and that by telling them about tangible benefits of poetry can bring them from curious to enthusiastic, and one of them is communication. Once you learn to understand your emotions more strongly and you learn how to put them into language that you can then see it as like, oh, there's a benefit outside in the world even when I'm communicating with people. So it strengthens community.
Yeah, it's, you try to figure out what to do with it. So the Poet Laureate of the United States has an office in the Library of Congress building that looks out on the Capitol. It's a rather grand office, and if you go sit in it, then you think, now what the hell am I supposed to do? So famously, the New Jersey doctor William Carlos Williams said, people don't read a lot of poetry, but they're dying every day for want of what can be found there. So there's a feeling, it's the American tradition in poetry, going back at least to, of course, goes back to the revolutionary generation, and earlier to Anne Bradstreet, this young English woman come to, in the 1630s, come to America. It's an incredibly rich tradition, and finding ways to share it with people, it's a good thing to do. I went to the Washington Post book editors and said, you should publish poetry like crossword puzzles. It should be in every week. There should be a poem in the newspaper. And in the 19th century, when Americans were learning to read, it was quite common to have poetry in newspapers, and it's gone, it should come back. And they said, great, if you will write a little short comment on each poem and pick a poem every week. And I've never been really great about deadlines. But I thought, oh, what a chance. So I said, yes, I agreed to it, and they would circulate it. I forget what it's called. Anyway, there are about 54 newspapers in the country that ran the features from and I suddenly found myself feeling like the Raskolnikov of deadlines, agreeing to write every week. And I did it for 4 years, just pick a poem and frame it with a few sentences to try to get that out. The other part was odd thing about the projections you get, if there's something quite grand about the name Poet Laureate, this is the Poet Laureate, that I got lots of invitations, and I discovered the world is full of gatherings that are looking for a speaker. One of the first invitation I got was an invitation to be on Sesame Street. I did a stupid thing that I now regret. I said no.
Aww.
I said no. I don't want to start out acting like this is something for children. I'm not this, you know. Ask me to speak to Congress about what's happening in the environment. I'd be perfectly happy to do that. Anyway, so the second invitation I got was from a Rotary Club in Connecticut, and I said yes, and business guys downtown interacting with. I said to the group here, this was in New England, why Rotary Club? He said, you know, in our town, if it weren't for the Rotary, the Methodists would never speak to the Presbyterians. And I thought, oh, white ethnicity is a much more complicated thing than I thought it was. Anyway, I happened to be talking to somebody, a professor of education, and he said, ask them about the graduation rate from their high school. And so I said, well, what is it? He said, I'll get back to you. And he got back to me and said, it's about 80%, 20% of the kids in Connecticut high schools are not graduating. And so I went to this morning meeting of hardworking, community-committed business people and said, thank you for inviting me. I have a question. Can you name all the linebackers of the New England Patriots? And most of them could name all the linebackers of the New England Patriots. And I said, what's the graduation rate from your high schools? And nobody knew, which I knew that they wouldn't, because I would have known the graduation rate from California high schools. And I said, there's something wrong here. And so I thought, oh, I found something useful to do with this Poet Laureate job, to talk to people about literacy. So anyway, that was how, and as a result of that, I got invited. I probably talked to 50 Rotary clubs around the country over the 4 years, and basically doing the same thing. I also made me realize that I'm not a politician, because after the third time I asked the question, I felt manipulative. I was calling up professors of education and getting the statistics that I wouldn't have had, and then embarrassing them by saying they didn't have them. And so I knew I had to change my act, which is probably why I write poems instead of give speeches. Anyway, the great thing about writing poetry is you get to do it all over again, think new thoughts, which my wife's poems are amazingly good at.
Okay, I'll ask one more, and I guess you brought up saying no to Sesame Street, but I know that you're involved in, is it River of Words? It's an eco-literacy program. Can you talk a bit more about how you get the kids involved in writing about their local environments?
Yeah, I mean, that was another thing. I'm not so much involved in it anymore, but so while I had this job of being Poet Laureate, there was money to invite a large group of writers in the natural history tradition, nature writers, to Washington for an event. And we did an event, and during that time I'd come to realize that no one is quite as cynical as a Washington reporter, because it's essentially a lobbying town and everybody's hustling them all the time. And we were doing all of this work to bring in Barry Lopez and Wendell Berry and Gary Snyder and Terry Tempest Williams, and so it was just this fabulous collection of American writers, Bill McKibben, thinking about the environment, and Wilson, and then it would be here and gone. So we started a program to get children in schools to write about their watersheds, where their water came from and how it flew. And there's now, it's an annual program. There are like 12 or 13,000 classrooms with kids in it from kindergarten through 12th grade, right, being as a unit of their social studies and science studies, doing art and poetry in connection to what they're learning about their watersheds. So that was I have no organizing gifts, so I did almost none of it, but it's really taken over.
Great, thank you. All right, let's open it up here. I'll leave you with the microphone. If you could put your hands in the air if you have a question for Robert, and you can.
It's not a question, but a reminder, just because you are asking about what great things Robert Hass did in his 2 terms as Poet Laureate. And I ended up reading poetry in Macy's with Carol Snow and Joshua Clover to celebrate the launch of Lancôme's poem. And that was Robert Hass idea.
Yeah, it's true. They approached me to figure out how they could launch Poem, and I thought, put a bunch of poets in department stores all over the country. That was fun. I was the co-chair of the Poem Committee with Juliette Binoche, who was also helped get people into that thing.
Last one, Rachel.
I wanted to ask you wove together such beautiful and harrowing images. I mean, especially that last poem, I really felt that. I wanted to learn or ask you a little bit about your process and how you tackle these topics that have such magnitude.
Yeah, thank you for that. The question is in relation to the poem, A Sunset, I guess. How do you tackle that subject? I have very complicated feelings about that poem because I don't think that's the work poetry generally does very well, that kind of argument. But my next door neighbor, my very near neighbor for 25 years in Berkeley was Czesław Miłosz, a very great Polish poet who survived the Nazi occupation of Warsaw, later went into exile, was living in the Berkeley Hills, and I fell into helping him translate his poems into English, and I did it for years. And he tackled complicated subjects, and he wasn't afraid of poetry that made serious arguments. And when I did, thinking about this, that we all need to be thinking about. You know, I mean, there's first of all how you address the culture, as I say in the poem, that puts this gun in people's hands and really is so crazy. It's just so there, and then there's our kids, and our own. You know, I don't know if poetry can look over the education system to say. Yeah, I mean, you could imagine all the ways it could be harrowing and wrong. I remember Berkeley schools are very earnest about, to finish the sentence, we need to be thinking about the moral formation of our kids. And part of that is certainly art, which this poem doesn't say, but grows empathy. How deeply can it be rooted? Is it really hopeless? The Hitler argument is that it's hopeless. But it surely is worth trying collectively for us to understand. Think about how appalling the political discourse that we've been submitted to for the last 6 months, and the horror of it for the next 3 weeks. You know. And anyway, there. I thought of Walt Whitman because there is that other America. There is that place that people believed. You know, I think of Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, when Whitman is just watching all the people going back and forth. Public transportation poems, you know. We're all in this together. We all have hopes and desires. Surely we can understand that about each other. Isn't that the foundation of the democratic feeling that goes with these institutions? Can't we grow it? When we've been growing just the opposite and 50% of us apparently love it, you know. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. Politics. But, so, yes.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you.
So, but to say, so what I was very conscious in writing that poem that I was going to marshal these arguments and try to do the kind of thing that I shied away from. Then, of course, thinking about John Ashbery and purely experimental, playful poetry, and saying, well, there's that argument, and there's this argument, and there's that argument. And I was aware that the material was very painful. And that poem appeared in the New Yorker the same week as the last shooting of children. A couple of weeks ago, or was it a month ago now? Yeah. So it's still going on, could happen tomorrow. On that subject of experimental poetry versus poetry that takes on moral subjects versus poetry that takes on spiritual subjects, I think of my wife as the poet who can put that stuff together so beautifully in her books. We'll get to hear her pretty soon.
One brief question. I know you've got books back there. Can you tell us what you've got and how much they are and how people can pay you?
There are a few books. One of them is an early book of mine called Praise. It's an English edition I have a ton of copies of, so it's right there. Please take one. And then the other two are, I don't know how much they are. You can see, but give him the money to be used for the Poet Laureate's work.
Oh, thank you. Okay, let's hear it once more for Robert Hassall. Okay. We're going to feature another poet before we open up the open mic. So, next up, we have another poet of excellent stature. Her work spans ecological concerns, notably through the classical 4 elements, earth, fire, air, and water. And she explores alchemical and Gnostic themes through an acute personal, social, and global poetic consciousness. Brenda Hillman's poetry often has a distinctive experimental style, but this style is not formless. It is akin to a gas inside a vessel. There's containment and form in her approach to language, inspired by various syntax-disrupting poets, including Rimbaud and Baudelaire. Hillman traverses effortlessly between the personal, lyric, and the collective, and back again. And her work frequently concerns the nature of change. Reading her reminds me of the British psychoanalyst and essayist Adam Phillips, who, no doubt inspired by Heraclitus's observation that the same river cannot be entered twice, states, "We should always be paying attention to how we think about change and how what we think about change changes over time." Hillman's poetry speaks to the nature of this consistent change. Hillman was born in Tucson, Arizona. She's published chapbooks with Penumbra Press, A+ Ben Press, M Press, at Minus Press and Albion Books, and as the author of 11 full-length collections, the most recent of which are In a Few Minutes Before Later, seasonal works with Letters on Fire, which received the International Griffin Poetry Prize, and Extra Hidden Life Among the Days, winner of the Northern California Book Award. Her most recent book, as Robert mentioned, was published in September 2024 and contains essays first given as lectures themed around the letter M, called Three Talks: Metaphor and Metonymy, Meaning and Mystery, Magic and Morality. I am currently waiting for my copy to be delivered. A Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Hillman has also received the William Carlos Williams Prize from the Poetry Society of America, the Academy of American Poets Fellowship, and the Los Angeles Times Book Award. Please welcome the other half of a powerful poetic duo, Brenda Hillman.
Thank you so much, Nathan. That was an amazing intro. And you got it just right about change, right?
Yeah.
Heraclidean fire. Thank you all for coming and giving some of your Saturday to poetry. I think that poetry is the main thing. That if we have food and healthcare, the only other thing we need is poetry. So that's how big I am on it. So this is the little book that they're talking about, and it's definitely yes, it's trying to cover a lot in a short space. So thank you, Bobby, for your beautiful reading. I think just as the Q&A, and Bob pointed out, poetry can be taken anywhere. You can take poetry outside. You can protest with it. I took my students out a lot. I'm going to read a kind of opposite type of poetry. I do a lot of meditation and trance work to write my poetry, and also just to keep mentally healthy. And one of the things I do in my trance practice is think about words, individual words, kind of dispersing themselves, and as they make their way in the mind. Autumn Ritual. So this is from a book called Seasonal Works with Letters on Fire. Autumn Ritual with hate turned sideways. I pull the hate on a rope ladder to the resting zone. H, H, H. Pull the A on down. A, A. Put that sick A to bed. Get well, A. Pinched fire. Bring the T down now. T, T, T. Roman cross before the Christian thing. Bump, bump. Put that T to bed. Put that Garamond T to bed before we kill someone with it. Such as whack, whack, weapons contractors in Virginia. Whack, get well, T, won't kill with you. Now, being able to breathe for the E. Breathe into the prongs. Slide on its back. E, E, E. Put that E to bed. Get well, E. Weird shapes around campfires below the mind. Tiny fires with hurt earth spirits as in Aeschylus. Resting letters now so they can live. And I will read two poems from the end of this book that has a rotting orange on the front. It's a book about minutes. I'm working on a second tetralogy that has to do with time. And I'm going to read two poems from the end of that. So I was trying to think of what to read to you. We're having fires in the Bay Area, and I'm sometimes called an eco-poet, and people ask what eco-poetry is, and I just say it's worried nature poetry. So I'm a worried nature poet. This is two poems from a series of poems I wrote and read to Bob right before he was having heart surgery, and I thought, you've got to get those poems to people you love. And this is about packing cars during evacuations. The themes in American literature. The great theme of American literature is the search for home, the search for love, the search. Great themes are not American. When the woman smells smoke, she packs her college notes in the trunk, packs the children's art, funny ceramics with superannuated glazes, packs the fossil collection from 60 million BCE, broken camera someone threw at her in DC, packs quilts made of overalls in 1923, centuries of women of all skin tones sewing and praying under their breath. The breath for women is low, and when you fold up that frayed thing made by a woman's hands, please don't ask, did your mother work? Some families don't save much. The woman packs her letters from the age of paper. Maybe she met her love in a book someone gave her. She met him between the lines of a letter. He lived nearby and came to drop a package for her then husband. Stood in the kitchen, handsome and kind. Stood in the kitchen now filled with floating ash. Seemed to listen with his whole mind. Did she hold her baby then? The story began to form. There's always a crisis. Great love starts in a crisis. Density of ash settling in the air, in the folds of things and wings outside. The wasp gall turns on its side in the night, abandons larvae movement, replaced by escape through punctuation, marks like the shell of a gall in the field at the end of time. She packs the letters they sent. He was in charge of summer. He was kind to her child. If there are specks of other people's houses in your mouths, if you were the settler or the victim of profit, now ashes of houses where some were loved and lived their lives are in the oxygen of many people now. Each time they pack, an epic is remade. No, 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 no more empires, please. No more stepping over prone bodies when wearing genteel yoga pants, please. No more fracking in the Pacific, please. No more climate idiocies. There will again be great cities where the dirt sits down outside. 50 million years of it. There will again be syllables to mingle with the plants and float to their demise. To the angels who won't return in the same way, but in an ashen voice of crystal time we say, before our kind shall disappear and your kind and their kind. And thus was the seventh seal broken, and someone was making a meatless dinner. And thus the lovers lived in ordinary glory, danger, air from the owl's wings falling over them, those who had loved before them and would love again, and the glabrous leaves made traces. By day the orange glow from the ring of fire blocked the sun. Let it be said, their bodies kept the chaos out. The alto moon of the smoke alarm glowed above their bed, while earth survived its humans through the tear at the back of each eye. Sensation rushed with its needed color, and dawn pleaded for a boat not made from threatened trees, nor wine dark, nor tragic, and never distinct from literature. Escape and exit. The lights come on in the great heat. Where shall we take our stuff? The storage unit down by the water has has doors like metal fire and chunky keys we can't lose track of. Others arrived with large carts they couldn't steer. Where are you from? We'd ask in the elevator. The planets gather in alignment over the houses and people gather strength. Boxes loaded in our cars again and taken out when the fire again does not come for us. The rat and the squirrel crouch at dawn, and late finches come with dull, fiery heads from the lenticels. We call to the 12 dark fields. We call in a timely way with only some of them burning. The small ones cry out and are sent on. The rounded ones cry out and are sent in. What shall we say to each other? Let's say, forgive us. We forgive us, we say. What shall we say to the young poets? Let's say we don't know anything. Let's meet when we are safe with the sighs of those who sigh. Let's meet with all our skin tones glowing. The angels at the back of our eye are safe in their pre-existence. They come through with as much change as they can manage. Friends keep saying the system, Amazon trucks with their toxic prime profits. Devil wind spools over the high basin, wide vortex over the Atlantic, former glaciers, as everyone's phones eat particles of rotting planet. We are let out of danger. It was asymmetrical. In sleep, a keel at the back of each blade, sent down, balancing us now. There will again be great cities. We escaped in circles as we waited in a few syllables, in the nothings past the nothings, in a few minutes before later. Thank you.
Thank you again, Brenda Hillman. Another round of applause, please.